All right, we should be live.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today.
Yes, I'm so excited to be on this episode of Trusty's Deep Vintage Dive.
Yep. So this is the first of at least a few that I've got scheduled, and I appreciate people are joining. I'm using StreamYard as a software, and we did a little bit of a test of it last week. So hopefully this all goes well. This is the first time I've actually shared the screen with anybody. So if we have any technical difficulties, go ahead and give us a little bit of slack and stick with us. We've got Amelia hanging out in the background, waiting to help us and helping monitor what's going on in the chat. So we'll try and keep everybody entertained. I have 6:58, so I'm going to hang out for a few minutes before we get things started and see how many other people we've got joining. So I've got Michelle from Comfy Cozy Living. Hi, Michelle. Great to have you with us.
Great to see you.
Oh, we've got Steve from Brick House Salvage and Antiques. I just discovered Steve. He has a great YouTube channel, and I've still got to catch up on some of his back episodes. But so he's on there, so welcome. I think this might be the first time that he's joined one of our chats. Gypsy Mills, seen your name before, so welcome, Gypsy. Laura, great to have you back. I'm glad you get a kick out of my daughter. I had no idea, for those of you who might be coming to me for the first time, once a week I've been running a live vintage sale, and where I'm actually selling products on YouTube. Vintage items on YouTube, and I use my daughter and my adult daughter to kind of help me along, move products, move things from my grasp and give me new things to sell. And she runs the chat, and I had no idea that in the chat she was just carrying on whole conversations with people and comparing the best alcoholic drinks. And this, my daughter is a college age student, so it was interesting for me to read that as a father later, but. Thrilled to have her. And so this one, there won't be as many moving parts maybe, but she is there. So for anyone who's joined us for the sales before and have had chats with Amelia will be online, and you can say hi to her. So Cindy Warman, thanks for joining. Jeannie Lyle, I think that's a new name. So thank you so much for coming on for that.
Hi, Mom. I have to say hi. That's Jeannie. She's on the broadcast. It's great to see you in the chat.
Excellent. So we said hi to Laura. So we've got a handful of people coming just on 7 o'clock. So we'll probably give you like 1 or 2 minutes to see who joins in. But for those of you who have joined already, again, thank you. This is something kind of new. If you've watched any of my videos in the past, I really like research, and I really like kind of chasing down details and finding out what I can. Even if it's something that I just picked up to resell, I'll still want to do a little bit of research into it and figure out, if it's a piece of porcelain, what does the back stamp mean? What, when was it made? Sometimes it doesn't even have necessarily any impact on its value, although it can. It's really just because that's the stuff that I really enjoy. So I tend to pick up things that I personally like and hope when I sell them, other people will like them too. Luckily, I can pick and choose. This is a side gig for me, doing the resale on Etsy. So I get to pick what I carry. Some people don't have that luxury because this is their full-time job and they need to flip as many things as they can. I can take a little bit of extra time and do a little bit of research, and that's what I enjoy doing. And so we'll go into this when we do the full introductions, but Katie, I tripped across Katie's YouTube channel, which is called Vintage and Vinyl. And she was doing some really nice educational videos that showcased several of her different collections, but one of them was a typewriter ribbon tin collection. If push came to shove, I might have known that those existed, but it certainly wasn't something I was conscientiously aware of. So she just talked so much about it. She's so passionate about the subject that when I started this idea of being able to do these Trusty's Vintage Deep Dive, that I'm trying to do a deep dive into very specific collecting categories or areas, and I want it to be pretty niche. I didn't want to do an episode just on tins. That could be very interesting, but that's so broad. I don't know how much detail we can get into. So this may end up being overly niche-y, and that may not be to everyone's taste. But what I really am hoping that these will do is educate a little bit and be available as a resource, just like Katie's videos are already on her site. as a resource for later. If you see these out in the wild, you will remember, oh, wait, I saw that video, or I know there is a video that talks about that. Hey, I'm going to look at that and figure out, could these be valuable? If you're a reseller, what did you find? What possibly could you resell it for? How to know if what you're reselling is actually valuable or pretty run of the mill. And if you're a collector, the same way. I'm doing a little bit of research to prep for this video. Katie helped me a lot. Some of the prices are all over the board. And so it's one of the cases that I'm sure I'm really going to be picking her brain on this is how do you know? How do you know what's valuable? How do you know what's rare? And how do you know what to be on the lookout for? So we're at 7:04. So I'm going to go ahead and start the introduction. So I appreciate all of you who have joined us. For those who do not know, my name is Patrick. I am with Trusty Huckster Mercantile. And Trusty Huckster Mercantile has a presence on Etsy as a vintage reseller. Primarily, I specialize in glass, porcelain, pottery, decorative objects. Admittedly, I've never carried the types of tins that we're going to cover today, but that's also what made this so interesting to me, is that I wanted to learn a little bit more. And what I have is my first in what will be a series. I do have a couple other people lined up. Next week will be another guest. But for the first in the series, I asked Katie from Vintage and Vinyl, and she is going to be talking about her collection of typewriter ribbon tins. So Katie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, kind of where you're located. I don't think you're a reseller, so kind of like what your background is.
Yes, so I am Katie from Vintage and Vinyl. You're probably used to seeing me here on YouTube. I have an Instagram account as well. And I love vintage items and antique items. I think what really got me started in that was my grandmother had a great collection of things, and she passed those down to me. And I have really gotten into researching all of them. And I think that it's so much fun. So that is really my background as far as vintage and antiques go. And the ribbon tins are fascinating to me because the graphics are so incredibly cool on each of the tins. So I really, really like that. But you can find me here on YouTube at Vintage and Vinyl. And I will be on Instagram at vintage_and_vinyl as well.
And I can hear in the background, your dog is wanting to make an appearance on screen. So what is your dog's name?
So my dog's name is Louie. She's a pug. She's about 1.5 years old. And when the sprinklers come on every night, she goes bananas for whatever reason. So hopefully she won't interrupt this program too much, but she's a lot of fun. I love Louie.
Now that just makes us more human. We try and make these as professional as we can, and we want it to be entertaining. But hey, we love pets, and if Louis wants to make his presence known, he's more than welcome to bark. And he said hello now, so now we will move forward. So your background, you said, kind of the interest in vintage really came as a result of some of the things from your grandmother. You said she passed those on. Now, did she actually pass on any typewriter ribbon tins? Was that part of the collection that you inherited?
No, it wasn't. It actually started with a Socrates tin that belonged to my great grandmother, and she carried that around all the time. And my mom remembers her having that tin, and I thought the graphics were really neat. I love that blue color. And I just started seeing ribbon tins at various antique stores when I would be out shopping, and I just thought they were so cool. So I started with one, and then now I have quite a few of them in my collection, but they're really fun to collect.
So you said it was started with a Socrates tin. Now, if it was your great-grandmother's, how old was that tin?
It's really hard to date tins. You kind of have to look at the graphics and then some of the markings on the tin to help verify whether or not it's an older tin. This tin was found in the 1916 Red Eye Singer sewing machine that I have that belonged to her. So I really do believe that it's an older tin. Of course, it's in pretty good shape, but she did take good care of her things. So my guess is that she used it and then reused it because there's baby pens, diaper pens inside of it. So it's kind of fun to have that memory from her. And of course, to find it in the sewing machine drawer is awesome.
Excellent. And as a side note, again, I stumbled across Katie's channel. She had done a post on George at the Antique Nomad. If you're not familiar with him, right around the beginning of the quarantine, he pushed out a challenge for YouTubers to show off your bunker. That's the hashtag, show off your bunker, all one word. And Katie, as well as I, did a video for that. And she shows some of the great items in her collection, including some of these tins, as well as that sewing machine she's talking about from her great grandmother. Now, tying that to the typewriter ribbon tins, if what I know of as of the old Secrets tins, probably not as old as what you have, is they would have had that hinged lid. Now, is that, so even the older ones were hinged?
I do believe the older ones were hinged. You know, it really helps when you're out in the wild to pick up these things with your own hands and look at the details. Because as I've talked about before with tins, one little detail on a tin could mean that it's a completely different tin from another one similar to it with very similar details. So one might be blue and silver, but the other one might be blue, silver, and black. Same hinged lid, same similar design, but completely different tins as far as the dates go.
Now, for the typewriter ribbon tins, are any of those, have you ever seen a hinged one of those?
I have never seen a hinged one of those
at
all. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. Now, there are some typewriter tins that actually screw on the lids instead of just fitting together like most tins do.
And are those newer or older?
Those are newer because they held half-inch ribbon sizes. So if you don't know, there's really an interesting story here with the Remington Company. They started making typewriters back in 79. And it's interesting because they used different companies to make their ribbon tins and the ribbons for the typewriters. And then they decided, you know, that's just kind of crazy. Why don't we make the ribbon tins ourselves and the ribbons? And so they cut ties with all of these other companies. Well, Underwood was one of them, and they got very upset over it. They didn't like it at all, of course, because now their contract's voided and they're out of business. So they thought, well, let's seek revenge. And their revenge was making the typewriter. And that typewriter was really unique because in 1895, when that typewriter came out on the market, it set the standard for half-inch ribbon size, which was new. Because before that, everything was 1 1/2 inch, which is a really wide ribbon for a typewriter. So it really standardized the market, which was new. So that's really interesting. And when you see those half-inch tins that are flat and round, I'll show you an example here, but they're hockey puck style, and they say half-inch on them. They usually are newer because they have the half-inch ribbon size versus a tall tin, which has the 1 1/2 inch size.
So that was something you talked about in the video when you covered the tins, is that the taller ones tended to be the older, but if they were older because they actually held a bigger ribbon, a wider ribbon?
Wider ribbon, that's correct.
Okay. Now, all my knowledge is either coming from Katie or from this book that Katie recommended. So I do have a couple of notes from here, but I'm also going to throw out for those of you who are joining on the live stream, this is live, you can enter your comments. If you have any questions or anything you want her to go into more detail with, go ahead and put it into the live chat and we'll try and make sure we jump to that. So one of the things, echoing what Katie just gave in the history lesson, is not anything I knew. I had to read it, and I've got a little Post-it note, but I found it really interesting because it said in 1880, there were only 2 manufacturers of typewriters, Remington being one of them. And I'm assuming Underwood, although the way the book was written, it wasn't clear to me who the other one was. But by 1900, there were hundreds of typewriters that are already out there. And so all of those then would need the ribbons. And one of the things as we go into, like, I definitely want to have a little bit of a educational history lesson as we go through. But so at what point did typewriters, you said Underwood kind of wanted revenge. So at what point did the 1 1/2 inch, like, was 1 1/2 ever a standard, or that was just because there weren't that many people, that was just what they did?
That was the standard before 1895, which we know, of course, is when Underwood kind of standardized the market. But I think that 1 1/2 inch ribbon sizes, and they were what we were called the tall tins, they were used because they had a wider ribbon, so it would stick up pretty high. So you needed the tall tin to hold that ribbon. But the older 1/2 inch ribbons, I still think kind of scattered themselves through all the way up until about 1920. because even though it was standardized in 1895 with that 1/2 inch size, I do think it took a while for everyone to sort of convert to that. But it certainly made it easier. I mean, imagine a big wide ribbon and you're trying to put that in the typewriter itself and there's ink everywhere. I mean, it had to be a total mess.
Now, at what point, according to the book, they had the tall ones, but then what were those flat ones?
So the flat tins are actually even earlier than the tall tins. And what's interesting about the flat tins is they did not have spools. So most of the tins, like I have one here that has a spool. So I'll show you. Most of the tins that we know today have spools. And this is a spool for a tall tin. And then you have other ribbons that would have had just regular, spools like this that we're all used to. But before that, they actually had flat tins where the ribbon would just be loose in the tin. And the idea was the companies would pre-ink the ribbon and it would come out on the typewriter. And the problem with that was they would tell people, hey, let's just have the ink be sent back to keep being re-inked. Well, that couldn't have lasted very long because that became costly and timely and people didn't want to do it. So they said, let's put ribbons in tins so that they could be spread out and the ribbons would stay fresh. So they invented those flat tins. And because the ribbon spools were pre-built into the typewriters, the ribbons didn't need to be on spools. So the flat tins are probably from around the 1800s, definitely before, 1895 when they started changing how things were done. But they would just put the ribbon in randomly kind of in the flat box and then give it to people. And that way they could get fresh ribbons anytime instead of just sending that original ribbon back to keep being re-inked.
Now, do you have any of the flat tins in your collection? It sounds like that date's significantly older than everything else.
It is significantly older, and I would love to have one of those tins. I don't. Actually, when you see those online, they are very scarce. There are not a lot of them around. So if you find, especially one from Remington, because Remington is really the first typewriter brand that was predominant back then in the 1800s, you have struck gold because I have seen those go in auctions for like $2,000–$3,000 a piece.
Oh, wow.
And of course, people will pay that if they really want something that's collectible. Now, I do have a Remington tall tin that's an earlier tin, close to the time when maybe some of those flat tins were being changed over to the tins that were taller with the spools, that is on the way to me.
Excellent.
A few days ago, and I'm really excited about it because it is an earlier tin.
So we don't lose people, to get too lost in people with the history lesson. We do have a couple of question that popped in from Joanne, and I think this can be relevant. It's asking whether we can comment on where we live and how that matters when you're finding tins. I will say that I am based outside of Chicago, and I have yet to explore the wonderful world of tins. I literally did not even discover that was a collecting category until I discovered Katie's videos while I was completely locked in my house as part of the shutdown and the quarantine, that's the rest of the country. So I've never been able to go out and look for them. I will say they're fairly common online, but their prices are all over the place. And so my knowledge is almost entirely online of what's available. What are you finding, Katie?
So I'm from Florida, and Joanne, that's a really good question. I find a lot of the hockey puck style tins like this everywhere. I mean, they're in the antique stores. You can get them for $2 or $3. And really, I don't think that it is hard to find those. Of course, certain typewriter companies did make their own tins, and then even like Woolworths had their own brand made for them. And that's more of a specialized to a certain area. So say if you live in New York, where a lot of maybe the tin makers made some of these tins, you might find some of the earlier tins, or maybe even one that was made specifically for Woolworths, because that affects that area, and more of them might be in that region versus here in Florida. But as far as the standard tins that you see everywhere, like the Carter's Midnight or some of these other tins, they're really easy to pick up, and they're fun because they're all different designs.
Now, as you talked a little bit about what the regionalization would be, one of the things from your videos and then doing the research in the book is that particularly the earlier ones, and maybe this was something that carried on all of them, they would have the actual brand of the typewriter would somehow be included. And one of the things that I was wondering about it was, in some cases, it looked like the name of the typewriter was actually incorporated into the graphics, and in other cases, it was just stamped on the back. And I was wondering if any of the designs, did they reuse the same design for multiple typewriters? So they have one style of ribbon that was specifically for Underwood, and then sell the exact same graphic for one that said Remington on it.
Usually not. Most of
Okay.
the time, as far as I know, and again, different tins have different things on them. So I don't know every tin that was out there because there's thousands of them available, which is great because you can really, keep adding to your collection without feeling that you've collected them all. But no, I think, certain, like this is Carter's brand. And then for this, they said that it's for specifically a Remington typewriter on the back. Now, some don't have that because it's interesting. People did reuse these tins for all kinds of other things. So a lot of times I've seen tins where someone has actually scratched out that typewriter name and then rewritten like safety pins or something else on it because they did actually practically use those for things. And it's really neat because Panama tins actually have a graphic on the inside showing you that you could use this for other things after the tin was empty. So you can see there's paper clips and fishing hooks and all kinds of neat things. And people really did reuse these. So sometimes that name will actually be gone off of the tin just because people were labeling it for something else.
Now, one of the things that you had mentioned, I think it was in the video, and then I saw it underscored a little bit in this book that you suggested, and I'll hold it up again. So it's actually antique typewriters, and then over here on the side is and office collectibles. So it's actually a very thin section that talks about tins, but the typewriter section is fascinating because I had no idea there's so many different.
Oh, it's amazing.
But one of the things that it talks about is, because I really want to get into the graphics as we look at what people are collecting. So, well, before I jump into that, finishing up the question before on the regionalization, do people tend to collect a certain brand, or are they tending to collect them by graphics or by era?
I would say it really depends on the collector. For me personally, I collect the tins by graphics. I really pick the tins that I'm attracted to. And I love tins that are Art Deco in design. I also love tins that kind of have a funny saying on them that lends an ode to writing, like Ditto or Eureka or like the climax of a story. One of them is literally called Climax brand. But then some collectors do like to collect a certain tin because the tins were made by a different company than the ribbons were. So some people might collect a certain ribbon made by a particular company, or like this Coors tin here on the side of the tin. And you do have to look, really up close because they're tiny, but I don't know if you can see there, that's decorated metal. And that was one of the biggest tin brands that made these typewriter tins. So some people might only collect, say, decorated metal tins, or something like that, or even earlier tins made by the American Can Company.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So then because I know back to what I started to go down the path earlier, is that it was the earlier ones actually showed a typewriter, and then those were the ones that tended to have the brand on it, and then they became more like generally graphic. So if the older ones, I would say you had one in your video called Improved Climax that was all text. Now I won't comment on the brand, but that tin would definitely be one of the older ones. Do people tend to collect them based on their age, or would they collect them based on the graphic?
I think some people do collect them based on their age. If you wanted to do a whole collection of just early fall tins, you could certainly do that, and that would be wonderful. It would look great. Or you could collect them just if you liked 50s stuff. You could just collect 50s time period. So it's really up to you. That's kind of the beauty of the collecting. You can decide what you want. And even if you just love, say, Japanese art, there's a whole series of tins that feature just Japanese art or airplanes from World War II. There's a lot of B-2s on some of the older tins, and you can collect that.
Now, doing a reverse history lesson, you mentioned, the graphics of the 50s, so that whole mid-century modern, which is so popular right now. But at some point, they stopped doing typewriter ribbon tins as tins, correct?
Yes. In the 1960s, they actually went away from tins And I don't really know the reason, but my guess would be that it just became expensive. Of course, putting out metal tins with such an intricate design probably got costly, and they went to cardboard and plastic. And they still make ribbon tins today, but they are in plastic containers.
Now, when you talked about the tin, what I also found interesting, and I didn't think of this until you said it, was they changed it in the 60s, and it probably was because other materials were cheaper or whatever the case may be. But what did they do with the tins during the war? Was aluminum available, or was the tin available to be able to make new tins during World War II?
That's a very interesting question, because they did pour all the effort as far as metal goes into the war effort. And I know with Coca-Cola, for example, they have little round discs that would go in the ground to help. Dr. Pepper made them too, but to help mark the street for safety. And that would help, of course, the kids cross the street. But they pulled a lot of those up to use as metal during the war. So my guess with these tins was they probably used what they had and kind of either recycled it, or even a lot of them may have gone through the war effort. That's a very good point.
Now, one of the questions that Cindy is asking, and I wonder if this changes based on the history of the tin, is what is the safest way to clean old tins? And does it change if you've got a tin from the 60s versus if you've got a tin from 1905?
So Cindy, I am really careful with tins because of the graphics. They are lithographed, all of the tins, unless you've got something like this where, it's embossed on the tin, so you're not really worried about messing it up. It's just straight metal. But if you have something like this ditto tin here, that gold is just going to come off. You can even see that it started to come off here. So what I do is I just take a really soft cloth, something microfiber, and just lightly clean it. Now, if the inside has been used for something else, like a Climax tin, the inside had a lot of grease in it, because I'm sure whoever had it did with it hard grease at one point. I just took a paper towel that was lightly wet and just sort of did the inside, and then I just left the outside as it was, because it has this great barber's graphic, and I really didn't want to mess that up. So I'm just very careful, and probably a little bit too fanatical, but you can just lightly clean them, and that will work very well.
Related to that, her follow-up question is, do they rust easily? And do you do anything special to maintain them or to take care of them?
I personally would not keep these in a humid environment, especially if it's a very moist climate like here in Florida. I wouldn't keep them out on the patio or in the bathroom. I would try to put them in a drier area. They're metal, so they will rust. And some of these, like I did took this Climax tin, but you see that with the grease, it's also really rusted. And then I have a few that I can't even get open, like this Everbest tin. I can't pull it apart. Like, it is really stuck. So some of those do rust, and the best way, really, I would say, is just to keep them out of a wet environment if you can. Of course, when they're older and they're rusted and you find them that way, you could probably maybe use a little WD-40, but then I'd be careful with the graphics.
And you said they're lithographic printing?
Yes, they are.
So that really doesn't provide any sort of protection from the rusting. So the graphic will rust right along with the metal, correct?
Yes.
It's not like they were enameled or anything that was protecting the metal?
Oh, no, they were not at all. So it's very easy. I mean, you can see here that there's wear. This is a tall tin. It's high grade. So you can see where they're thin metal too. So they do easily dent and get scratched and rusted. And personally, I like that because it really does show its history and its character. I love especially this one where it's had the grease in it, because you can see that someone really used that, and it tells the life of the tin. I find that fascinating. But most collectors that are diehard collectors would say, well, that's not a grade 8 to a grade 10, so I don't want it. So that's up to you if you like the rust.
Now, one of the things you just mentioned is when you showed the life of the tin, and in the whole vintage resale world, that's patina, and that can be a good thing. But I know that in your video, you actually have one of your tins has never been opened. Do you have that available to show?
So this is an Old Town tin, And what's really neat about this tin is that it has a little strip here. Let's see if I can, there you go. And it has a painter's key, or just like a key on the bottom, and you would use that key to open the tin. And of course, once this was opened, I'm pretty sure that you couldn't use the tin because the edge would be all jagged. So most likely after this got used, it was thrown away. So having something like this that's sealed is really, really cool because it had never been used. It probably sat in the bathroom for how long. So that's amazing.
Joanne has a follow-up question to that is, do you find many with ribbons in it?
Sometimes you do. A lot of times what people would do was, for example, like this Carter's ribbon here, they would take the used, and this is a used ribbon. I mean, it's really seen better days, but they would take the used ribbon out of the typewriter and then just stick it back in the tin. Now, sometimes, you don't find them with the ribbon because, as I said, they reuse them for all kinds of things. So a lot of times, if they didn't store the ribbon back in there, they would just throw it away and then reuse the tins for hairpins, whatever. So it's very rare, I guess, when you find something with the ribbon.
Now, I remember from your video you mentioned, I think it was that Carter's one, that you were going to take some of your time during the quarantine and see if you could figure out how to re-ink it. Did you actually attempt that?
I haven't attempted that, but I did do a little experiment before I did the Carter's 10 with a Sharpie that had dried out. And I stuck the Sharpie in a little bit of water and then closed the cap and left it upside down for a few days. And believe it or not, guys, it was good as new, like I had bought it from the store. So I'm going to attempt that possibly with this ribbon, and maybe I'll have to do a video on that and see how it goes. It might be pretty messy.
Now, I think it's the Carter one that you're holding is the one that was embossed. How common was it to do that level of detail in the tins as opposed to just having the flat graphics on there?
Most of them, as far as I know, and what I've seen out in the wild, is not embossed. Now, this tin is a relatively common tin. I would say that you do see it. It's not like it's rare or anything, but the embossing is definitely different compared to most tins. Like this one even just has a sticker label on it. And then, but most tins were lithographed, like this Eureka tin here has that lithographed. And I'm sure that that was a little bit easier to do because the tin companies would make the tins and then send them to the ribbon makers, and the ribbon makers would then put on the graphics and do the design for the tins.
Gypsy is asking what year is that one, if you know, what year is the one that's never been opened?
So my guess, Gypsy, with the graphics here, is I would probably have to date this to probably 1950. I wouldn't say that it's super old, especially because you see that it's secretarial ribbon, and they did market these a lot in the 50s for secretaries. And that's why the graphics did get a little bit more intricate in design because they really wanted to appeal to the ladies. If they saw a pretty design, especially like this Columbia ribbon with the pretty dancing women on it, that they might be attracted to that, especially since it's pink and it's really decorated, and buy that for the picture or buy that typewriter too for the ribbon to go along with it.
Now, at what point, because I think I saw some in your collection, I definitely saw some in the book and also online, where the graphics completely strayed away from the idea that they were even typewriter ribbons, that they didn't say the word typewriter, they didn't say anything about ribbon, it was simply decorative. At what point did that become, I don't know if it ever became common, so if you want to touch on that, but at what point, if you're saying it started being marketed to secretaries, was that more, okay, that's a female oriented, so we're going to make it just general, or is it because people knew they were being reused for other things?
So in the 1800s, you will see a lot of tins, and I have a great example here. This is an aggressiograph tin. It's a tall tin, so it held the 1 1/2 inch ribbon. And you see there's a lady on there with an address machine that would make addresses, and there's a typewriter on that side. So that was put on the tins sort of as a way to market the tins as, okay, this is for a typewriter, this is a good brand, it's very practical in the design as far as that goes. If you saw a typewriter, then maybe you think, okay, this is a really good sturdy, long-lasting, good brand. And then I'd say about 1920, when you started seeing a lot of these Art Deco pens come about, you would Art Deco, not you would kind of go away from that because they were more interested in appealing to people that work in offices with ribbon. But I'm sure that there's not a specific date, you know.
Now, a lot of the ones that you've been showing, once we moved from the tall tins down to the shorter, and I think you referred to them as hockey puck, most of them seem round, but I also saw both in your collection and in the book, some of them were square. Was there one that was more common than the other? And was there a reason some of them would be square versus round?
You know, that's a good question. I honestly don't know the reason that some of the tins were round versus square. I'm sure it was simply just what the brand did or the tin companies did at the time, because a lot of the tin companies did reuse the metal from what they originally were making. So for the tin can company, they actually made cans, and the leftover metal they would stamp the typewriter tins out of. So my guess is that if they had whatever leftover metal they had and they could use and it was the appropriate size, then that's what they would do. So maybe some of these are square because of that versus the round. So here's a round tin and here's a square tin. But I don't think that it really makes a difference as far as collectability. You know, it's just up to you what you personally like.
Now, I know you said that they started changing from the all tin in the 60s. And I think when we were prepping for this this session, you had mentioned that I think you have one in your collection that was kind of a transitional piece where it was metal on the top and then cardboard on the bottom. Were those all circular, or did any of those, were those square? I'm just curious if the square was a later thing or if it was an earlier one.
I think most of the ones that you see that have the cardboard on the bottom, like this one's cardboard here.
Oh, the Carter's one is cardboard? Oh, I didn't even realize that. Okay.
Carter's one on the bottom is cardboard, and then the top is embossed. I think that those probably most likely were just available throughout like the 50s and the 60s. I mean, some were all cardboard and then some were metal. I mean, most of them were metal, but a few were cardboard. I don't think that there's really a difference. And I never see the square ones with the cardboard face. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not out there, you know, because I said there's thousands and thousands of these tins and all different brands and designs. So there might be one and I just have never come across it, you know.
And was there a long transition at that point in the 60s, or did some of them go straight to cardboard? Did some go from all tins to straight to cardboard?
That's something I honestly don't know. You hit the hard question of the evening. You know, typewriter tins aren't a big collecting area. As you mentioned earlier in the video, most of the people in the advertising tin world collect coffee, tea, and tobacco. So you're going to find a lot more information online about those areas. Typewriter tins are sort of a smaller area. Not a lot of people collect them. And so there's not tons of information about that, you know, online or in books that I've read.
Excellent. We had a question that came up earlier, and I knew we'd get to it eventually, and now I lost who actually asked the question. But there was a question about your favorite tin in your collection.
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, one of my favorites probably has to be this Elwood tin. I love the Art Deco design on it, and of course, I'm attracted to the typewriters. And probably also this Helix tin. Again, it's Art Deco, and it's really, really, really beautiful. I love things that have a lot of design. They really paid attention to the detail. And then, of course, the ditto ribbons, because I love when they have an ode to writing on the things. I think that's kind of a creative marketing thing. I don't know if they did that on purpose, but I find it very fun.
That was Jeannie's question. So thanks, Jeannie, for asking that. Related to that, and I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to it, I'm assuming it's one of the tall tins, but do you know which one is the oldest tin in your collection?
The oldest tin in my collection most likely is this Agressiograph tin. And one of the things that I did in preparation for this interview is I got to talk with the person that wrote the book, Daryl Rare, and he wrote that Typewriter's Office collectibles book. and he talked about this pen on the phone, and we talked about how this background here above this lady's head is screened. It's a darker background. So if you collect Coke trays, you know what I mean. He girl with the wind in her hair has a blue background, and then the one that everybody has doesn't have the blue background, and the blue background is a little bit more collectible. This pen is older because it has that darker background, and also it is 1.5 inch ribbon size. So this is probably the oldest one I have. I would say this one's probably from 1900.
And do you remember your first?
Yes, my first ribbon pen was the Hallmark pen, and I absolutely fell in love with the graphics. I think that H is so beautiful. It reminds me of those storybooks as a kid. You know, the Cinderella and all of those Disney fairy tales have that big H at the beginning or the big T, you know, and I just thought it was so beautiful.
And what era would you put that in? Because I think one of the areas that I maybe get hung up on the semantics is the idea of what the graphics mean. And to me, that's very typographic, but it's not necessarily, there's not a lot of imagery on there. So at what point, that to me, that's primarily text. So is that an older one, or did they still do primarily text and typographical ones even into the 50s?
They did that even into the 50s. You know, really the only way to date a pen is, first of all, by the metal company that made it. If you can find that on the pen, usually they're very little on the side or on the bottom, or you date it by the ribbon size. And this is not a tall pen. It's made for 1/2 inch. So this is definitely a newer pen. But my guess would be this was probably from the 50s. And all the tins, like even this one, just is very plain with the clean lettering there. So they did that also up until, I'm sure, into the 60s as well.
And I think you touched on this a little bit, but where are you primarily finding them? I've obviously done the research that I'm finding them online, and you answered a little bit of what's in Florida. Are there conventions? I mean, again, we kind of have to go pre-COVID, but are there conventions for things like this that you would attend? You mentioned antique stores. Where do you tend to run across these?
I tend to run across these at antique stores. Every antique store has a lot of them scattered out through various booths. There's one in particular I go to, and I know the gentleman that has the booth, and he always has a lot of them. He gives me a great discount. So I usually end up paying $2 a piece for them. But on eBay, you can get some good deals. And the first couple of tall pens I bought 4 of them in a lot for only $11 free shipping. So it was a super deal. So on eBay is also where I find a lot of that tins, and that's the older tin I talked about that I ordered, like the tin that's very early, is coming from eBay, because those I don't ever see in the stores.
And do you see them very often? Do you do much with Etsy or Poshmark or Mercari, some of the other maybe smaller online resources?
I do search Etsy. Etsy's a really great place to look for tins, but I do find that their prices are a little bit higher, and I don't tend to shop there for that reason. When you go online, the prices, as Trusty mentioned, are really all over the place, and it's not one person's fault. You know, it's sometimes it's very easy to go on eBay and say, well, I have this pen here, and I've never seen it before. I don't know anything about it. And you see another one, and it's listed as rare, so you think, okay, well, that pen must be rare. But in reality, probably there's a lot more of them than you think there are. So then that gets listed as rare, and people tend to jack up the price because they think, oh, well, I can't find that. And on Etsy, you do tend to see that a little bit more, as people think that because they're like this pen, I've seen go for a lot of money. And to be honest, it's quite a common pen. You can pick it up, you know, at various antique stores, and people will have it listed for like $25.
One of the things that the book covers, and Katie and I talked about this when I first was asking what book to do some research on, and she suggested this one, that it's old enough that the values aspect isn't particularly relevant, but there's this little section that he does in the beginning where he talks about type 1 through type 6, and it's not necessarily a grading system, but as he goes through all of his images, he actually highlights each design on whether type 1, which is considered a common tin with plain decoration, or type 6, which is the rarest tin with an attractive decoration. The prices maybe aren't relevant anymore, but I liked that aspect of it. So then when I started cross-referencing what I saw on eBay and on Etsy, I say, oh, okay, I'm seeing a lot of this one. Oh, yep, it's a type 1, so it's not surprising. Or, oh, that one's really cool, but it's asking for a lot of money. At least this guide, and just an underscore, we are not supported by this guy or this book. This is just something we're doing for this video. But at least it backs it up to say, oh, okay, so maybe it is a more scarce because this is listed as a type 6. For those who know George from the Antique Nomad, he is very vocal about the use of the word rare. And you hit it on the head that Etsy and eBay does it too, but the word rare gets bantered about quite a bit when it's not necessarily rare, particularly in the online world when you can find so many of them. I had a question that had come in that it's basically either the one that you feel is the rarest, or is there a unicorn or the holy grail for you of a tin that you want to add to your collection?
So I would say the rarest and the holy grail tin for me would be this tin here. And let's see. Sometimes this camera's funky, guys. I'm so sorry. But this tin here, this is the really early flat tin from the 1800s before they had ribbon spools. So I would love to find that tin if I could. But as I mentioned, it's going for a couple $1,000 online. Also, there's a tin from, I think it's from the 1930s. It's very Art Deco, but it's an Addison tin. And it has the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building on it. The Dixon Bridge going across the bottom. And it's very Art Deco. So cool. But I do not see that tin anywhere, even online. I even asked Daryl Rare about it, and he did mention this was a scarce tin. And I followed an auction yesterday out of curiosity, and it was up to $4,000 for that one tin.
Wow.
So maybe one day I'll get lucky and I'll go into that antique store and somebody will have it and I don't know what it's worth, and I'll get it and I'll be so excited.
And of the ones that you've owned, whether it's because you've paid the most for it or you found it from somebody that didn't know what they had, what would you say the rarest in your collection is?
Probably I would go with this Adressiograph tin. They are common, but mine has the darker background there. There's one that's got a lighter background here in this little area, and that definitely makes it a little bit more collectible. And then this Ditto tin as well. You know, they made a lot of Ditto tins. These are pretty common, but this particular one has a different graphic than the other ones. And this makes this one a little bit more special. And so I paid up about $15 for this, which is usually not what I would pay for a tin, but I love Ditto tins. And I wanted this particular graphic, so I was going to pay a little bit more for it.
Did you say 50 or 15?
15.
Okay, so $15 is considered paying up in the world of typewriter ribbon tins?
I would say so. As far as the most common round, smaller tins, when you're talking about like these tins here, I mean, especially this one, or nylon typewriter ribbon, plain is one that you see a lot out there. And I think that this is probably worth $1 to $2. You know, 10 at the most if you want to do the whole grading system and say, well, this is a grade 10 and I can command some more money for it. But typically these are very inexpensive. So for me, I would consider that paying up. Now this tin here that's on the way, this Remington tin, that's an early tin from the 1800s, from the very first typewriters. I did pay about $25 for that, but I did have to pay international shipping. It's fairly expensive because it's coming all the way from London. But that is worth it to me.
And I will say that will be something that for those who are interested in pursuing or interested now in tins because of this, you will find the prices on eBay and Etsy are far higher than that, because that Panama tin was one that I just really liked the graphics of. It was very common, but I think the cheapest I was able to find it was something like $8, and then I had to pay shipping on top of that. So I was not paying $1. So unfortunately, if you're doing them entirely online, you're going to be paying a little bit more of a premium. But that's good to know that even something that you consider one of the jewels of your collection is not, you're not talking about hundreds of dollars.
No, no, unless you get someone that really, says that it's rare, or, and they want to up the price. And that does happen online. And of course, if you go to an antique dealer that just deals in tins, typically you will pay more money because they know what some of these tins are worth, and they also know the grading system. And that's kind of the standard way to kind of price tins. I mean, as far as the graphics goes, yes, more graphic, more design. Sometimes, especially in the case of something that's Art Deco or features like New York City, might make it more expensive, but also they know that that's like a grade 10 versus a grade 1, and so they know where to price things versus just the average generalized collector that just sees a 10 and thinks, oh, someone will buy this for their decor, I'll slap them out.
Well, indirectly, I think Joanne is asking a question that you've somewhat answered, but I wanted to clarify it. So Joanne is asking, in antique stores, are they stocked in glass cases because of prices or sizes? So based on what you were saying, unless it's a specialty collector or specialty seller that knows the grading system, they're probably under glass. Is it because they're afraid of theft, or are they trying to put forth the idea that they're more valuable than they actually are?
I don't think it's really because of theft or because of value. I think a lot of, personally, and our antique stores do this, is a lot of the small things get lost and jumbled in little boxes and they get scratched. So our booth, at the booth that I frequent a lot for tins at this particular antique mall, has a very tall trio cabinet. It's not locked, but it is sliding, and there's little shelves there where you can stack the tins on top, and it just makes it really nice as far as the display piece, because then you walk by and the graphics really can catch your eye that way, and it keeps them safe.
Water Baby commented that she saw a cute idea where someone used an old typewriter in their flower garden, planted pretty flowers in the top. I will be honest, that slightly horrifies me, but I guess if the typewriter isn't particularly valuable or super common, maybe it's not a big deal.
Yeah, if it's a common typewriter, it's got a lot of rust on it, or it's not usable anymore, then maybe. But that's hard for me to wrap my head around.
But then I also am a huge believer in something's only valuable as much as you put value into it. And if you've got a typewriter and you don't have an old desk, you don't have some place to put it, and you have this great idea to have a creative flower garden. I've seen, people use old brass bedsteads to make their flower bed, and they, turn it into a bed in the flower garden. You just don't think about the fact that that's maybe destroying the bed, but it's maybe giving it a different life. So I guess that typewriter was saved from the recycling bin, I guess. But similar question, I think you might have commented on this before, and I think this was in your video, that you actually own a vintage typewriter. Do you own more than one?
I don't, and I'd love to get into typewriters. I saw a movie years ago, I think it was on Hallmark Channel, and the guy in the movie was a writer, and he had all these old typewriters hung on the wall, and it just really interests me. I would love to do that, but my typewriter is an Underwood typewriter, or a Woodstock, I'm sorry, from the 1930s, and what's neat about it is it belonged to my great-grandfather's secretary, and she actually won a typing contest on that. She was the fastest typer in the Midwest. And so that's kind of a special family piece. I love that typewriter. And it's very Art Deco on the side. It has that curve with the Art Deco line. So it's a really fun piece.
That's a great story. And there's so many other stories that Katie shares in the videos on her channel. So in interest of time, we're going to start wrapping things up. I wanted to keep this under an hour. We had a question that talked about how you got started. We covered that a little bit at the beginning of the show, so you might have signed on a little bit late. But this is reviewed once this video goes up, but it's also covered in the videos that she shares. I highly recommend checking out Katie's Show Off Your Bunker Challenge. You'll find the playlist for all of the videos that were covered in the Show Off Your Bunker Challenge. You'll find that on my page, but you can also go directly to Katie's page at Vintage and Vinyl and find all of her playlists. I think at last count, she has 4 videos that cover tins. 3 of them specifically cover advertising tins. So there's definitely far more information you can get through those videos, and more of the personal stories that came along with each one of them. and a great look at her collection and her aesthetic. We had a comment earlier on, I'm scrolling and seeing if I can find it, but somebody highlighted that your Coca-Cola tin tray collection looked fantastic behind you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Makes for a great backdrop. And if you are exploring the videos in the Show Off Your Bunker Challenge, you'll find another one is done by Vintage Vinny, who also happens to have a very extensive Coca-Cola collection and specializes in Coca-Cola trays. And I think actually, Katie, you said you've bought some trays from Vinny, haven't you?
Yes, I have. I just got the 1912 Elaine Girl tray from him, and that was a huge find for me because they're usually very, very expensive online. They're an early tray, and it's one of the only elongated trays, so it's really unique. But I am just thrilled to have that. And I bought a Flapper Grill tray from him from the 20s, and I didn't have that one either, so it was very fun.
Well, fantastic. So you can check out his video because he then will be my guest on next week's edition of Trusty's Vintage Deep Dive, where he will specifically be talking about his collection of his personal collection of Coca-Cola trays. So you get a little bit of an eye candy watching the trays behind Katie, but we're going to bring those to life during Vinny's interview next week. So I appreciate everyone joining me. It looks like I got a couple of comments popped in, just making sure. Thanks for everyone joining me again. My name is Patrick. I'm Trusty Huckster Mercantile. You can find me in social media at THMercantile, short for Trusty Huckster Mercantile, on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube you've already found, and Etsy. If you've gotten this far into watching the video, first, I'd like to thank you. Appreciate you giving us your time. If you haven't already, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Believe it or not, that actually does make a difference in how I'm found in the YouTube algorithm. And if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe and sign up for those notifications because there will be at least a handful more of these scheduled and doing some specialty topics every week, every Sunday. So Vintage Vinny will be on my show next week, 7 o'clock for his Coca-Cola collection. And don't forget to check out Katie at her Instagram and YouTube pages. With Instagram, you have to do it with underscores. With YouTube, you search it by Vintage and Vinyl. And I will be posting all of the links to her pages and all the information that's out there will be going up into the show notes. So you can watch for that. So I appreciate everyone giving us your time, and I'm going to go ahead and sign off. So thank you so much. Thanks for putting your trust in Trusty Huckster, and goodbye to Katie as well. Thanks so much for your time, Katie. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.